Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another conversation on the current situation of tertiary education in Iran. My name is Negar Pato, and with my colleagues, Dr. Ensia Erfani from the International Community of Iranian Academics, we present the situations in Iran and the scholars and the students who study in tertiary education sector in Iran. Thank you for being with us. We are very glad to have you because this discussion is not only important, but also necessary. Each time we return to the subject, we are reminded that the pressure facing students, scholars, and universities in Iran are not easing. They are deepening and they deserve careful, serious, and sustained attention. We are also very concerned that as the peace discussions and between the US administration and Iran administration continues, the pressure on universities exacerbates and increase. Now, in our previous episode, we discussed the serious pressures facing the students and the scholars in universities in Iran, including execution, arrest, intimidation, internet blackout, and the broader attack on tertiary sector. We also examined how international organizations and institutions have often responded in a slow, selective, or inconsistent manner. In this episode, we want to take a conversation into a slightly different but very relevant topic. We want to ask what it actually means to be a student or a scholar in Iran today and how that experience is shaped not only by the repression that they face from the state and the Islamic Republic inside Iran, but also by Iran's isolation from the international academic world. So, this is not a story about sanctions being the main reason for academic hardship. The main responsibility of these issues lies still with the Islamic Republic and its restriction, censorship, isolation of society, and its constant pressure on the students and the scholars. The state has made it so much harder for people to study, teach, publish, travel, and take part in global academic life. So when we talk about these barriers, we are talking first and foremost about the political system that has created them. This is matters because being a student or a scholar in Iran is not just about talent or motivation, it is about dealing with barriers at every stage. So today, in this episode, we want to look at the full experience of being a student or a scholar in Iran. What does it take to apply? How does it take to publish? What does it take to attend a conference? And what happens when even success doesn't necessarily mean that someone can move forward? This is the reality we live in and we want to talk about. So, NCA, thank you again for being in this discussion and talking to us about these issues. Now, I know that you have firsthand experience in experiences some of these barriers, many of them. So, how does Iran's isolation shape academic life from the very beginning? What does it mean to be an academic in Iran?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nagar, for really continuing this episode. It's really wonderful and valuable to really talk about the experience of the Iranian scholars, including also students, also the faculty members as well. Because it's not, as you mentioned, it's not just a pressure and from the government. We also have also facing such kind of the restrictions from the academic society. Of course, there was also many supports also for Iranians as well that we should not really deny that, and we deeply appreciate it. But the point is that, when the country is really in a conflict situation, in the case of the Iran, that we are in this situation for almost 5 decades, so that's also affecting a lot the isolation of the Iran, and also the state in general also affects the scientists as well. And we know that Iran is the more regarding the population is the first brain drain country in the world, because the many students and scholars, because of the many reasons, they really want to leave the country. And also we also see this pattern that in any uprising that happens, the immigration increases, that including also the students and scholars. So in the case of the Iranian case, being a student scholar, one of the main reasons that affects your science is the mobility issue. That, because of the visa restrictions, delays in the visa issues, security checks, background checks for Iranian students and scholars, it makes the life so complicated. So imagine that you are invited for a conference, and of course you cannot apply too much in advance, because we know that the conferences maybe they just inform you 2 months in advance that your presentation have been accepted or you will be able to attend it. So in many cases, it's not really possible for Iranians to get the visa in that really limited time, even for the short time that they want to go to participate in the conferences. And if you get fellowships or scholarships as a student or as a faculty member, we heard a lot that the students really facing a really long-term visa issue process. And sometimes it could take even years that at that time, if you could start your education, you could finish your studies, but because of staying in that limbo condition for 2 years or 3 years, you even lose the situations of, being able to start that. And in many cases, the universities, they don't collaborate anymore because they have a limited grant. And of course, they cannot keep it for the next, academic year. So if you cannot get your visa on time, you will not be able to continue your education. And in some cases also, we know that, for example, in the case of the UN, after the Trump administration, Iranians completely banned from traveling to the US, that also including the students. So then that was one of the main destinations, actually. US, Canada, Germany, and Australia are the main destinations for the Iranians to continue their education. And one of them, which was the US, has completely, get out of the radars of the Iranians, and many students have been affected by that. So this is one of the issues that we have, and also that the sanctions also affect the life of the Iranian students worldwide. One of the main challenges that they have is that they cannot open a bank account in these countries because of these restriction. Imagine that how you can live without having a bank account in the countries that they are not even using the cash anymore. So everything is really utilized. So it's really, really challenging for these people. And in many cases, even before, the visas of the students were the one-way visa. So you didn't have the multiple visa. So when you chose that you should go to another one country, you really knew that you will not be able to come back after ending your studies, because leaving the country means that you should reapply again for visa, and nobody could guarantee that you are going to be able to get it. So one of the main challenges that, as I mentioned, is the mobility. So Iranians, that they don't really have the freedom of the traveling for the conferences, for the having them continuing their education, and also the sanctions also cause that the Iranians cannot apply for many grants, that they are worldwide grants. And it was also specifically mentioned in some of the specific grants, really famous one that I don't want to mention them here. It was mentioned explicitly that if you are from these sanctioned countries, please don't apply, because they knew that they will not be able to transfer, the grant that you are receiving, or even the awards that you are receiving from these really great awards. So Iranians are completely excluded from that. I can even tell another experience that maybe looks really strange, that even the online courses, because in the online courses that they come really familiar almost few years ago before COVID, Iranians could not get the certificate because they were not be able to pay for the courses, to be able to get the official certificate. And unfortunately, even as an Iranian, you couldn't register for these courses. So it was really impossible. It is really, really strange that even if you wanted to pass any courses online, you were not able to do that. And of course, in general, you could not get the certificate, which is really a strange situation. And it was, I also even remember that after the COVID, when the Zoom links really become popular, even the name of the Iran is not in the list of the countries that you could choose. And it was because the Zoom is, restricted by that community for the Iranians because of the sanctions that affect. So imagine that even the Zoom is not available for Iranians. So you really need to use the VPN. So your country is not in the list. So really, really strange things that people from outside, they are not really aware of that.
I also want to mention a couple of backgrounds for those of our audiences who are not very familiar. So, as a result of sanctions, Iran is excluded from any form of credit system. So there's no credit card in Iran that functions. And of course, as you know, all the Western universities have a English language requirements, which means that the students have to go for exams. But these exams, often for a while, they were taking place in Iran, but then after sanctions, and every time the political situation get worse, they move to neighboring countries like United Arab Emirates. That means that everybody who applies, even in the case that wants to apply, have to go to one of these countries in advance, which is another expenses that they have to endure, and sit in the English language requirement test, and then bring back so they're eligible or they can actually apply. So this is additional application procedures that becomes much harder when internet access is unstable and institutional support is lacking. No university supports students for studying abroad. It's often very complicated and difficult to get references from many of the academics who sometimes do not wish or cannot provide students with those support. So it's very subjective. Isolation of Iran is it's not only a diplomatic condition, it's actually a daily academic environment in which students live in. It also affects how students imagine their own future. Many of them, especially when conflict situation arises, many of them have no access to the global academic world, and their access is limited. Many of them begin to feel that opportunity exists somewhere else, but it's not for them. That feeling alone can shape motivations. It affects their confidence. It affects their long-term planning. So the problem is not only technical, it's also psychological and structural as well. In addition to these momentum, every time that the state wants to put more pressure on the students, they make the process of getting your records out of university very complicated. So if any students have been reported to committees for any form of political advocacy, for any activities, getting your records from university becomes a mission and sometimes can be procrastinated for a very, very long time, which is another aspect that can block them from having access to academic institutions. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about publications because we both have had very interesting experiences. But what is important is that one of the conditions, for example, for PhDs in Iran is to complete an internationally recognized publication. And because of these states problem, internet blackouts, political issues, and all the sanctions, often having access to global academic world and publications are very limited. So a state has to sometimes compromise and say that, for example, such requirement is not needed because they cannot actually fulfill the responsibilities to protect and to support students. So it's not only the fact that they are constrained politically and ideologically, can't think critically because they don't allow them to write about the critical thinking, but also that they put a huge amount of systematic pressure on them. But I want to talk a little bit more about this combination, Insia, between the state pressure and the international isolation. So if it was one, it would be as difficult. But now what you were talking about is that these two, state pressure and international isolation, reinforce each other. So would you like to say for example, what would be the process of participating in the conference, money transfer, or all those issues that you have faced?
Yeah, just you mentioned about the effect of the sanctions in general, that one of the effects of the sanction in Iran is Iran completely excluded from the bank, system, that we don't have the SWIFT, and also none of these credit cards also are working in Iran. So we don't have a Visa or MasterCard for the Iranians. It also including the Iranians that they're also living abroad, because there are also limitations for the Iranians to be able to open an account. But just focusing on what's happening inside the country is that some of the journals you should pay for the fee to be have an access, free access for that. In all around the world, universities pay for that, that their members, they have an access to these journals. In the case of the Iran, even the Ministry of the Research and Science in Iran, they cannot even allow to pay these registrations for having then access to the journals. And that's the point, you can, when you cannot pay for that, of course all the Iranian scholars will be completely restricted to having access to these journals. And as an Iranian, if you want to get access to these journals, you should ask your friends and colleagues abroad to be able to send you, that these published versions of the articles. And that shows that how the sanctions really affecting scientific community. And of
But
course,
sometimes even that doesn't work, yes?
doesn't work, yeah. But also the point is that the Iran also, of course, as a scientific community of Iran, also is a member of the several organizations. Because for example, I also remember that for example, we were the member of the Astronomical Society, International Astronomical Society, and for years Iran could not pay for the membership fee. So we were suspended because of that issue, because the Iranian Astronomical Society cannot pay because of the sanctions, the registration that they have. Although I could also say that economically it becoming really harder and harder each year to pay this fee because the economic is becoming worse every year. But even if we economically we could pay for that membership, it was not possible due to the sanctions effect. It's just an example, and I'm also sure that the other scientific communities in Iran also, they were facing the same thing. If they wanted to be the member of the really global organizations, that the Iranian, for example, astronomers, physicists, or the other topics could get benefit of these organizations, but unfortunately it was not working for the Iranians. And definitely, if you want to participate in the conferences, some conferences, of course, they have the financial support for the travelers. Iranians could not receive such kind of the support because now with the regulations of the university, you cannot receive, the travel budget by cash. So you should have an account to be transferred to your account, to be able to get the benefits. So even if because of the economical conditions, as a student or faculty member, you were not able to participate, even if you get the financial support, you will not be able to get that support because you don't have an account. And many universities these days, they don't pay by cash to you, because of the regulations and the policies that they have. So it makes the life so complicated. You also mentioned about, the requirement for the applying for the PhD or even master positions, that you should have a, English certificate at least. And we know that in Iran, it's not possible to take these exams because of the sanctions and all these restrictions. So you are forced to travel to third country. And imagine that how economically could be really difficult for Iranian students, and going to another country, just taking the exam, and how difficult it is for them to pay the registration fee. So it really too much restrictions and limitations. And these days, unfortunately, we also hear that many journals are not becoming open access anymore. So even if you want to publish their ones, it will not be open access, even if you are able to pay for that. So Iranians are not able to pay for these journals. And in many subjects, the number of these journals are becoming, less and less per year. And you are really limited that how you can, publish your articles, because nobody will gonna have an access to that because you cannot pay for the fee. Of course, some of the journals, when they understand the situation of Iran, they really try to collaborate because they know that there is no way for them to transfer the money, even if they are affordable to pay the fee. But not all the journals are really so collaborative. And unfortunately, even due to the sanctions that imposed in some specific universities of Iran, that they are in the list, that some of the universities are in that sanctioned list. There is not really a scientific sanction list, but because of the security, they said that you should not collaborate with these scientists from these countries. So if you want even to publish, that you have the affiliation from these universities, even if you have collaborators from outside of Iran, these days many journals, they don't accept that article. So they said that it's not suitable for our journal, without really telling what is the reason what's happening. So it doesn't matter in what subject you are working. In general, having the affiliation from that specific university or institute from Iran means that you will not be able to publish. So it doesn't matter that if your subject also is not related to security issues, for example, nuclear physics. So these are the limitations that Iranians are really facing. And unfortunately, there is no really specific rules for that because, for example, there are some journals based in Europe that they accept your papers, and some of them they don't accept it. Nobody really knows that where this policy exactly comes from. So if this is the global policy of the European based, for example, publishers, why not all of them having the same policy, but some of them have? So that these are one of the challenges that even if there are such kind of the unwritten limitations, you are not really aware that where it is. It looks like somehow the glass walls and ceilings that you just realize that when you touch it, so it's not really visible for you. So it happens also for me that I send my publication to some specific journals that before I could publish there, and now they don't do it because they realize that I have a collaborator from specific universities from Iran, so that's becoming harder and harder.
Absolutely. I also I wanted to add a couple of points, and this is about the repression of the state. So it seems that the state repression of from the Islamic Republic and the international isolation, it's kind of intertwined with each other and they reinforce each other. They become the aspects of the same lived realities. For example, if a student is arrested or for any indication of their political activities, they will get criminal charges by the state. And then you want to apply to study abroad, and then that becomes a criminal background. And many of the states do not accept somebody with criminal backgrounds. Now, you require a huge amount of advocacy and in additional documentations to kind of try to prove that what you were doing is not a criminal activity. You were explaining your political views. But these are the major issues. So at home, they are facing censorship, surveillance, fear, direct punishment, and then abroad they face visa barriers, payment problems, sanctions over compliance. Embassy closures is another one. So every time something happens, an embassy is closed in Tehran or in other or in neighboring countries, and they don't process applications. All these applications for studies remain unresolved, and in many times they use the opportunities that they had to study abroad. There is also no institutional pathways. No universities in Iran has any indication of supporting, and a lot of times the students complain about lack of sympathy from many of their academics and institutions in support of their applications or the process application. So the result is that the same person has to navigate both political suppression, global exclusion simultaneously in a way. Now, this is especially exhausting for scholars and students in Iran because the barriers that we are talking about do not come all at once. They are accumulative. So every time you're going to go to the process, in every step, you face a barrier. So for example, scholar may manage to get accepted to a conference. So NC can talk to you about that, but then cannot pay for the fee. A student may get an admission offer, but cannot obtain records in time. Someone may publish a strong article, but are not able to travel to present it. So isolation and repression, they coexist and multiply each other's impact. And I think this is very important for students. Now, many of the institutions, academic institutions in the West or other countries, they are bound by their institutional laws, but they consider universities in Iran to be equivalent to universities in the West in terms of public academic freedom or in terms of support for the student, but that does not exist in reality. Now, um, let's talk about what does actually take for an Iranian student or scholars to either leave Iran or publish in Iran or publish abroad or participate internationally.
Yeah, it's really, really limited. I think it becomes much more limited than before. So, because if even if you compare the number of the Iranians that they could participate in the conferences right now, and you see that really big, huge declination for several reasons. Because economically now it's almost impossible to really travel. Even as a faculty member, your grant is not really sufficient even to participate in the national conferences. So imagine that how the economical condition is really terrible. That I remember that in 2016, with the grant that I had, it I could travel to countries, to countries abroad to participate in the conferences, but not that budget has not changed. So the grant that you're receiving, so of course the economical condition of the country is also becoming worse. So with that money, you cannot even participate in the national conferences. So imagine that how the terrible is the situation. So even if you be able to participate in the conferences, as I mentioned, that you can get the financial support, then you will not be able to receive it. So because of the sanctions, you don't have a bank account. And even sometimes the universities, they don't also accept the third person, that budget, that grant could be transferred to the third person, that you can receive it from the friends or colleagues or whoever. So that shows that, okay, you are really completely isolated. And also sometimes that's also affecting the Iranian participation in the conferences, because the organizers, they don't accept Iranians to go to the conferences because of these kind of the sanction. And unfortunately, recently I heard in some of the specific topics that people supposing that maybe it could have a dual usage in their studies. That even if the Iranians are present in the audiences, they ask them to leave the conference because they don't want to share what they have want to share with the others, with the Iranians. So that's one of the really sad stories of the scientific community, because as a physicist, I'm hearing a lot from the colleagues that they ask audiences, if there is an Iranian, please leave the room, because we are thinking that maybe they are talking about some specific issues. I also heard from some colleagues, living in different countries, that their university, because at least few years ago it was possible to have some international conference in Iran, and some of the colleagues abroad, they were really interested to travel, or even Iranians that they are living abroad, they really wanted to come back home to really share their knowledge with the Iranians, and their universities forbidden them to participate in the conferences in Iran. And they told that you will not be able to use your travel grants to travel into Iran, because then you should be responsible that with this budget you travel to your home country. So you could travel, but you should just not do the scientific activities there. Otherwise, you are not able to use your grant. So these are the pressures, even not for the Iranians that they are inside of the country, that they want to leave for any scientific events. Even the ones that they are living abroad and they have a really permanent scientific position there, they are also becoming limited, that they cannot share the knowledge that they have with Iranians. And unfortunately, recently we heard about the internet blackout in Iran that affected application of the many students. And of course the statistics could show that in the number of the Iranian students that they applied in last 5 months, that the internet was not really stable in Iran. For more than 2 months it was completely blocked out. Many Iranians, they lost the deadlines for the many positions for the graduate studies. And that's how they are facing such kind of the issues, that they couldn't follow what is about their application. And maybe they received the positive replies, but they couldn't really follow that. So it's really becoming much difficult because of the many reasons, and in general the isolations of the country. So then it's not really easy to be the Iranian scholar from inside of the country, even from outside of the country. And even for one of the cases also has happened that for Iranian students, when they study abroad, even if not really sensitive topics, they are not really aware that which topics the regime of Iran is really interested in. And we heard in the history of Iran that many Iranian scholars, that they had the dual nationalities, or they were working some specific subject that Iranian regime don't have access to that. When they entered the country for the family visits, they have been arrested because the regime really wanted their science and their knowledge to be shared with them, and they denied, and many of them have been arrested for a long time. Right now, for example, we had Ahmad Reza Jalali, that he's in prison for more than 7 years. We had the case of Omid Kokabi, who was the physics student, graduate student, working on optics and laser. When he traveled to the country years ago, he was arrested and he stayed in a prison for more than 7 years. So these are the challenges that Iranians also facing with that. So even if they are studying some specific projects, they are really, worried to coming back home to visiting their families. So they are somehow choosing a selective somehow exile, not to come back to the country, because they don't really know that if the regime of the Iran is aware in which projects that they are doing, in which organizations that they are working, even though they never do the political activities. So they are completely, neutral people in the case of the politics, but their scientific subject that nobody really knows that which subject are in the radar of the government could put their life in danger if they come back. And of course, even when they have also the dual nationalities, unfortunately, the countries, they are not really supportive to protecting them. So with the laws of the Iran, they said that okay, they have also Iranian nationality, so they will be really punished by with the Iranian rules. So even having the dual nationality will not be helpful. Imagine that as a student that you don't even have the another passport. So these are the challenges Iranian scholars even living abroad, they are also facing that. So many of them, they chose to stay in exile just because they don't want to lose their academic position or the scientific positions that they already have. That they really get it with many many challenges. So it was really time consuming, but with many many challenges. So they don't really want to destroy their life by coming back home for a really short visit.
Yeah, absolutely. I also it really takes far more than academic merits for students and Iranian scholars to either be able to come out of Iran or continue studying outside Iran. So families in Iran have to carry the most of the burden with either through the process of documentations or providing money and access for travel, timing, developing language skills, and all of these require a huge amount of investment from families. Some of these families, even though the economic situation in Iran is near the collapse, many of them have to or accepted to support their children out abroad, just to give them an option to study somewhere else. And these families get into huge trouble, financial trouble, because the currency prices change and they are not available, or they can't no longer support their children. But also, if they can financially, it would be very difficult to actually send the money to them. Now, students, Iranian students, who, like many other international students for whom English is the second language, not only have to deal with timing, language skills, lack of family support, and often have to go the third route, country route, because direct access to many countries is unavailable, and go through this huge navigation of everything. Sometimes they can't even contact their families. So during the war, the recent war, Iranian students, many of them had to deal with huge amount of psychological stress. They still have to study, they still have to pass their exams. They're staying in the country that they are is dependent to their studies, so they can't actually don't have the luxury to not to study, but they are under huge amount of um, problem and huge amount of stress. Now I want to also add another note that because men in Iran have to go to compulsory military services, for men, these compulsory military services can complicate departure or delay applications even further. So when they become 18 years old and have to go to spend 2 years of compulsory military drafting in Iran, it's not really their choice to where they place them to do their services. So they sometimes get placed into the National Military Force or sometimes get placed into IRGC. Now, if you, by any lack of luck, as a young man is stationed in one of IRGC stations, you practically cannot come to a lot of countries because you have to say that you worked with IRGC, and of course IRGC is renowned as a terrorist organization. But in fact, these poor students have no saying in where they can go to military drafting or not. So that's compulsory, and where they are placed. Now, for women, additional social and mobility constraints may add another layer of difficulty. For a while, they need the permission of their father, their grandfather, in the absence of their father, the grandfather, or if they're married, from their husband, to be able to get passport, let alone to travel. And all of these applications and getting permissions can sometimes hinder they traveled quite extensively. So even when one of them succeed, the process is usually very expensive, exhausting, and it's very fragile. So it can always something happens in the country, in the host country, and then Iranian university can be targeted as bad elements or can be pressured by universities even further. Now, this is only the visible part. Behind it, there's often long period of uncertainty, repeated applications, financial stress. Then you have to think about how you can proceed your studies, even if you succeed to come out of Iran. And of course, emotional exhaustion that Iranians feel always as the result of political turbulences that we experience. So many students spend months or even years trying to make one opportunity work. So when people abroad assume that success is just a matter of applying well, Iranian students miss how much hidden labor, miss a lot of labor has to go through this every step of their application, which is by itself a major problem because in the longer term, they also have the issues of how to place themselves in the society because for them, often plan A of returning is very costly. Now, Ezia, you mentioned something about science and the issues that scientists face. Now, humanities and social sciences are even in a worse situation because the Islamic Republic is inherently against humanities and social sciences. They often limit their courses. They have had plans, very public plans to Islamicize human sciences, humanities, and social sciences. So there's a lot of restrictions, and many of people who do study humanities and social sciences often cannot go back or are go to volunteer exile because the topics that they study cannot may not be like directly political, but it might not suit the taste or the appetites of the Islamic Republic. So there is always a chance of exile, which can go very long, and separation from families when the students want to come out from Iran. Now, I want to talk. I want us to talk and close the session with talking a little bit about how does it impact the intellectual life in Iran and the future of knowledge, particularly now with all the restrictions and sanctions and the issues that we are facing. So, how do you envisage it would affect Iran and Iranian scholars and students at here?
No, actually, when I'm comparing the situation of Iran at least 20 years ago when I left the country to do my education, when I'm comparing it right now, I just see that, okay, even the economical conditions and all these sanctions also restricted having an access to the knowledge in Iran. So the labs of Iran, especially, that in the theoretical subjects, Iran is working well because you don't really need the instruments, infrastructure for working at that. But when it comes for the really technology, when it comes to the really advanced topics that they really need to the experiments and labs and access to the really new instruments, due to the sanctions, Iranians are not really allowed to have an access to that. So unfortunately, the science of Iran from the experimental point of view is completely behind of all the really advanced topics that they are running right now in the world. So this is one of the effects that we have. And unfortunately, when the Iranian students, they also have the chance to continue this education abroad, they, as we mentioned, because these topics are could be sensitive and could be really in the interest of the regime, they are really worried to come back home because the regime doesn't have an access to that. So they really want to use the knowledge of these people by really forcing them to collaborate with them. So from one side, really wants to complete the lack of the information and the knowledge that you don't have an access inside of Iran. So he really wants to get to the advanced studies and really updated topics in the case of the science or even other studies. But unfortunately, if you choose such subjects, then you will put in your life also in danger by accepting that probably you will never be able to come back home just specifically passing, following some specific topics that it could be really normal topics for other students worldwide. But as an Iranians that you want to follow your interest in these specific topics, even these days even AI could be, in the interest of the regime. That could be a really normal subject for many students worldwide. But Iranians, by studying these kind of this, could put in their career in a danger by coming back home. So these pressures from the regime for the Iranian scholars are becoming increasing and increasing. And unfortunately, the restrictions and limitations for not being able to leave the country, as we mentioned, because of the visa issues, because of the more sanctions that impose on that, because no trust to the Iranian regime, that also affects the Iranians as well in general, because the Iranian passport losing the values each year. So that also restrict many students to leave. And as you mentioned also, that in Iran, since the education is free, you don't have an access to your grades, you don't have an access to your official certificate. So if you want to receive the official certificates, you should pay for the government. That it becoming really expensive these days for the students, so the families cannot really afford that, so which was not the case before. One of the main issues also, I should also emphasize that at least in my time when I was a student, although the economical situation was not good, but I never felt that I should work. I should have a job, at least a part-time job to be able to continue my education. But these days we are hearing that, the families, they cannot really support their kids to be able to follow their studies, especially if they are not living, if they don't do their studies in their home cities. So if they are living in another city, especially if they want to go to Tehran, which is the capital, it's a really expensive city. So for having, even for paying for the dormitory fees, not even having their own flat, the students should work. And also imagine that in this economical condition of the countries, that the jobs are really limited, how it could be really difficult for a student in really young ages to living in a really city that they don't have any relatives there, and also forcing to be worked and also continuing their education as well, and meanwhile also applying for the positions with all these restrictions and limitations that we talked about. That so when I'm comparing myself with the students these days of Iran, the talent is the same, but unfortunately they are facing more problem. And of course, the trauma of the living in this limbo condition of the country, that one day the war start, the other day, the sanctions imposed on the country, the other day the deals happen, the internet block out, the suppressions from the regime, all these massacres that happened in January. So there is a really big trauma among all the Iranians that also affects the life of the students as well. And unfortunately, the universities are almost blocked out since last January, since January in Iran. So that, imagine that how your education will be limited if you want to go to that to do your lab courses or whatever. So it's not really possible for you to do that. Not all the subjects are serious subjects that you can just do the online courses, although we know that the internet connection was really, really terrible in Iran. So these days, the students are really facing too much pressure. And unfortunately, even if you do the small activities inside of the university, we hear that the regime also detain the students. Recently, we hear that some of the students, they lost their right for education without even going to the course. So the university committees, they took the decision that, the students should be suspended For not before, it was that the penalty was suspension for few semesters. Now they really, expel out the students from the universities, and they don't allow them to continue their education in another university as well, because before, sending the students to another university was one of the punishment. Now they don't even allow them to continue their education to the another universities, and for some of the students they even take their passports, so they are not even allowed to leave the country. So imagine that, how it could be really difficult that you are doing, normal activities, that from the point of the Iranian regime, it could be considered completely political. So you are not even allowed to leave the country. So the pressure is from inside and also outside. And I also mentioned that even the students that they finally find a chance to leave the country, that becomes one of these brain drain issues that we have. Unfortunately, even they are not really having the normal life as other students that they have. And they are also, even if they participate in the political activities, even going to the protests, if they've been, detected by the Iranian intelligence service that they are even outside of the country. We hear that many several Iranian students, that they, when they were active in these protests or in the activities outside the country, when they entered the country, they have been detained. They were not allowed to leave the country. So this is how that affects your life. So you don't really have the normal path as any student, as any international student. So the sanctions and the shadow, I always said that the shadow of the dictatorship of Iran is always with you. Doesn't matter that you are living in the country, or you find a way to escape from that situation. The shadow is always with you, for the visa issues, for the opening the bank accounts, for specific topics that you are not really allowed to follow it up. So there is always the limitations for you as a student, as a scholar abroad. So it's not really easy life.
Yeah, absolutely. As you mentioned, the combination of this pressure from inside, and the censorship and surveillance and torture, execution, arrest, it drains talent from Iran. So while we have been talking about how much obstacles and barriers are in front of scholars and students in Iran, they all have been trying, majority of them have been trying to get an opportunity to leave the country. But the reasons that it concern us as well from what's going to happen inside Iran is that these policies and these very terrible situations that the state has created for students and scholars, it's deepened inequality within Iran, and it weakens the country's intellectual future. So if those who can leave often do so because they see no viable paths inside the system, while those who remain must work under conditions that discourage research, publication, and international participation. Um, Over time, this creates a widening gap between Iranian scholars and the global academic world. It also means that Iran loses not only individuals, but also whole generations of potential contributors to science, humanities, policy, and public life. And we can see the outcome of these terrible policies in the way that the trajectory that the state has for example, major national issues such as national security, development, economic development, political development. So all of these lack of state policies in this regard are absolutely the result of this terrible situation that has been created in tertiary education. Now, it also creates a divide inside society itself. So students who have a stronger family support, better English, or more connection can sometimes find a way through, others can't. So the system, and because universities overseas are now changing too. So I remember 20 years ago, when my generation wanted to apply for universities, we never actually paid for our application to be viewed. But now many universities have put that fee as a part of this assessment process. And because of that fee, even if somebody accepts with the currency exchange rates and all these barriers we have been talking about, you have to apply with another $80, $70, a huge amount of money for them to be able to even let your application to be assessed by a university, let alone being accepted. Um, so not only that, the system in Iran doesn't treat all the students equally, it also provides an inequality that follows the students even for the furthering their studies abroad. It actually rewards those with resources, leave the less behind, and that is one of the most painful part of this story, because the talent that we have in Iran, the amazing students who work very hard, sometimes cannot get this opportunity. So thank you very much, NCA, for being with me for another episode that is sponsored by the international community of Iranian academics, who is, we are all concerned about what's happening in Iran, and we want to document and make sure that these events and these realities on the ground have always been recorded. So we close this episode. We want to return to the central point. Being a student or a scholar in Iran is not a matter of education. It's the matter of navigating a system that places obstacles in ways of learning, publishing, mobility, and participation at every stage. What we have described is just not only a set of isolated difficulty, but a structure of exclusion that is built through repression at home and isolation from the wider academic world. The result is that many talented people are forced to spend their energy simply trying to access the basic conditions of academic life. That's a loss not only for them, but for the Iranian society, as well as for the international community of academics. So, our hope is that this conversation helps make that reality visible. We want to raise awareness, not as an abstract problem, but as a lived condition that shapes the present and future of knowledge for many in Iran. And if we are serious about academic freedom, intellectual dignity, and the right to participate in this world, then we have to recognize that Iranian students and scholars are still being asked to do the impossible with too little support and too many barriers. Thank you for being with us during this episode. We will come back to you with another episode on the situations in academic institutions in Iran. Thank you, Nancy.
Thanks a lot for that.